Now there are going to be several of these, and these are going to cycle once we've added the JavaScript necessary to do that. But for the time being, just while we work at our layout, we're just going to place one in the markup. If we refer back to our PSD, you'll see our testimonial comprised of some quotation marks, the testimonial itself, a little attribution there, plus our call to action, and then underneath the slide some small simple navigation which we'll use to navigate our way through them. In terms of markup, we have our slide containing an H2 tag which has got our quote. We have the attribution in a span at the end of that, embedded sort of within it, and then the call to action, which is simply an anchor tag with the words "see how" within there. Now we'll also need the slide navigation, although this will be generated dynamically. For the sake of styling it to begin with, let's just add that in under here. Now you can see that's just a div with a class of slide nav and 4 anchor tags, one of which is active. So that done, we can now go about styling it. So we'll quickly just Command and S and save that, and then we'll open up our CSS. Let's take a quick look at exactly what we've done in the browser there. That's not looking particularly exciting, but you can see exactly what's gone on. There's the call to action there. Alright. So to begin with, let's style our H2 heading. Now we were going to use Google Fonts, if you recall. I'll just open up the PSD. You'll recall that we were going to use a font called Lato, or Lato. I still don't know how to say it. So if I go over to Google Fonts, where are we? There it is. We'll open it in the web fonts. Now it's quite easy to see how we use it. We wanted the normal and the bold, if you remember, and it quite simply tells you here how to add this font. It's a CSS file, and it requests that you stick it in your head tags before anything else. Of course, we're going to have to declare the font before our own style sheets, which are going to continue to style them. So let's just add that, and we'll add also the Droid font while we're about it. There we go. So this is our Lato, which is the same little bit of syntax we were just offered up on the Google site, and this is the same sort of idea, but for our Droid serif font. So that's our fonts declared, so we can now go about using them in our style CSS just as we would any other font. So let's begin with an H2 declaration here, and we'll begin by simply saying that we want to use this Lato for our font family, and we want that's not a serif, it's a sans serif, of course. We could do with using the bold derivative of that. Why do I keep hitting that key there? That's frustrating. Okay, according to our design, that was at 58 pixels with a line height adhering to our baseline grid, if you recall back to that lesson, which is a multiple of 20, because our paragraphs work on 20 pixels of line height. That's at 60 pixels, and the color I'm going to have to go and grab from the PSD itself. So we'll open that up, and it was our dark green, if you recall that. Okay, so that's our H2. That's a general styling, and we're going to have to, of course, style our slide H2 in terms of its positioning and size slightly differently, but that's a good start. The Betty Biggins, our little attribution here, we could style that next. That should be fairly straightforward. So let's begin by adding a testimonial section here. and then I'm just going to grab some styling which I've prepared here, just to make things slightly quicker for you. And you can see here I'm calling the Droid Serif font. It's 18 pixels font size. It would ordinarily have inherited the bold from the H2 which we'd in which it's sitting, so we need to specify that it's a normal font weight, and this is going to be the italic version. So quickly just jumping back and refreshing the page, you'll see that we've very quickly achieved that result. Now the H2 itself, according to our design, is much smaller than the width of the slide. Having measured that, I happen to know that it is 560 pixels wide, and that we're going to need a margin on this left side of 60 pixels to the edge of the document. So that, where are we? Achieves that very quickly. First I'll have to save that, obviously. And there we go, it's looking much better. We have the 3 lines of text. Now, in order to add this speech mark here, I've used a graphic because the web font doesn't coincide 100% with the Droid serif that we've installed on our system. It was a much less fancy quotation mark, and that's not what I'm after. So I've altered the sprite sheet and added that as a graphic. Now we're going to use the interesting before pseudo element of our slide, and what that basically does is takes our slide element, this one, and it adds a sort of sub element, a little sort of dynamic element, the before element, to that, and we bring that into existence using content, which is currently nothing. We could put text or anything in there if we wanted, and we display it as a block of 35 pixels square. We're then going to position that absolutely, and in order for that to work, we first need to make sure that our slide has a position of relative, so that this will be positioned absolutely at the 10 pixels from the top and 0 pixels from the left of our slide. Now it's going to have a background using our sprite, and if we just go back to the sprite, I've measured across here 250 pixels from the side and 150 pixels from the top, and you can see that referred to here. We pull the sprite image 250 pixels left, and we pull it 150 pixels up, and we ask it not to repeat. So if I save that and I refresh the page, you'll notice our before pseudo element 35 by 35 pixels with our sprite as its background. Perfect. Now we're going to do something very similar for our call to action, which is currently just an anchor there, simply styled. I'm going to grab the styling quite quickly so that we can just race on with this. Here we go. Now this is it. We've given it a class of CTA, call to action, and we're asking for something very similar actually. It's going to be a block displayed element, so we can determine perfectly its width. It's 102 pixels wide. We're going to give it a padding on the top of 110 pixels, which means that it's going to effectively be a block, something like this. The padding at the top will give the text room for the graphic. We'll align the text in the middle of that 102 pixel width. Again, we're using the sprite as its background, and again I've measured exactly where it should be, so we have to shift the sprite image 220 pixels to the left, and it's at the top of our sprite, so that's fine. Again, identical typeface to the attribution there, Droid serif, 18 pixels, normal font weight and italic. We've got rid of the text decoration, which would otherwise have been a straight line, an underline under the linked text itself, and we're positioning it again absolutely to the right of the slide, although it is 80 pixels from the right of the slide, I should just mention, like so, and we're positioning it slightly up from the bottom of the slide as well. So if I save that and I refresh the page, you see exactly what we've got there. Our block element with padding at the top, typography exactly the same as this, and sitting neatly at the bottom and the right of the slide. Now, it will take too long for me to style everything else here in this upper section while you watch, so for the time being we're going to leave it like that. Needless to say, I'm going to be styling these 4 links to emulate these links as we designed here. Before the next time, I'm going to just style these links for our primary navigation, and I'm going to make sure that this smile link, the main link, takes on the appearance of our logo, like so. Okay, so we're making good progress. I hope that was clear enough for you to follow along with. So now I think it's time for some further reading. So we're going to jump back into my presentation. Oh, we've already done this one, excuse me. Alright, have a look at what's said about the Web Standards model over on the World Wide Web Consortium wiki. If any organisation has a sound opinion on web standards, it's the guys who actually develop them. Next we have this. Take a look at HTML fundamentals. You really can't do much better than this article by Michael James Williams over on ActiveTuts. Now, before we jump into the next video, I have an assignment for you. Keep going with our files. Continue to build the HTML and CSS as we've just done in this video. Next time on 30 Days to Your First Website Design, we're going to look a little more closely at markup and semantics. I'm Ian Yates, and from all of us here at Tuts Plus, thank you for watching. Hi guys, welcome back to 30 Days to Your First Website Design, a Tuts Plus premium course. I'm Ian Yates, and today we're going to look a little further into HTML and semantics. We'll begin as always by taking a quick look at what we're going to cover in this video. We're firstly going to define semantics. We'll then look at some examples of what semantics are and what they're not. Then we'll complete our own document's markup, adhering to the rules we discuss. Finally, after some further reading, and before we jump into the next video, I'll ask you to complete an assignment. Now, the word semantic with regard to HTML is used to refer to the meaning of the markup used. These days, with the arrival of HTML5 syntax, we can use elements such as nav to denote navigational elements of the site, whereas previously we might have just used a div with the class of nav. We also have footer, which you'll have seen in our web markup. Previously we might have used a div with the ID of footer, perfectly understandable for whoever wrote it, but not a recognizable standard. Having more semantic elements at our disposal allows us to more clearly describe the contents of our web pages. Remember the standards model we talked about in the last video? The separation of structure, styling and behavior? Well, using semantics with our markup simply helps us to give fundamental meaning to our HTML without having to visually describe it. Semantics further aid the accessibility of our document. Screen readers don't use the styling we define, so by explaining them with markup what each area of the page is for, screen readers can better interpret what they're looking at. Semantics also help to clean things up, as the 2 examples I've given you suggest. Now, it's worth noticing that practicing semantics doesn't just apply to the elements you use, it can also go as far as the selectors, the classes, the IDs that you define. Take this for example. An h2 heading tag with a class of red, or a div with a class of left. You might think these are fine, and you might come across them in examples you find on the web, but actually in assigning identifiers like these, you're tangling up the structure and the presentation again. Who's to say that this left div won't be positioned at the right of the page in the future? You might then have a CSS rule which looks a bit like this, which would be utter nonsense. Keep your selector names semantic. Describe what you're building, not how it might appear. Okay, so that's covered the meaning of semantics. Let's now finish off our markup as semantically as possible. Let's exit first our presentation and we'll jump back into Coda where we have our index.html waiting for us. It will all look fairly familiar to you. I haven't changed anything in the meantime, but I have made some additions to the style CSS, which I can demonstrate to you now by opening Google Chrome. Here is our page in its current state. As promised, I've added styling to the logo. I have just polished up the primary navigation, and I added a bit of styling to the navigation for our slideshow. Now, these links don't actually do anything yet because, as I mentioned, these are going to be added dynamically using the jQuery plugin, which will power our slideshow there. So if you refer to the styles, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because I'm afraid we just don't have time. Logo is built with just a couple of groups of rules here, the H1 and the anchor within that H1. Primary navigation isn't much more complex. Notably, the primary nav, which is the unordered list containing our navigation there. If we just refer back to Google Chrome and I inspect the element, you will see that this UL element here has been neatly positioned in the top right hand corner of its containing wrapper. Lastly, there was the slider navigation. Again, very simple. Each one of those little buttons is simply an anchor which has had its text indented way beyond the boundaries of the link itself, and it has a background using our sprite. So that's all perfectly clear. The slide nav, which is the containing div, is the width of the whole page, and you can see it has a text aligned centrally so that all of those little links sit neatly in the middle of our page. Okay, now back to the point of this exercise. We're going to add the missing elements, all the markup that we need to add, and if we refer to our PSD, we can see that we're talking about these three columns here, two larger columns in our contact area, and the information in the footer here. Now for our three columns within our team area here, we might normally have used a div for each one. We're actually going to be concentrating more on the semantics, so where a more semantic element is available, it's advisable to use it. We're therefore going to go for an article tag. So let's find our team. That's here. We're going to stick 3 article tags in here. Now an article is can be described as a sort of independent chunk of information. If you can imagine it going into your RSS feeder, for example, and you don't need any other information around it to describe what's going on, then that is worthy of being an article. In our case, we have, for example, an image, a header, and a paragraph. And you can imagine that if you were to remove everything else around here, you'd have enough information within this article to understand what's going on. Now I have actually prepared some markup here in order to just speed things up because we're running against the clock, I'm afraid. So having placed this article here, I'm just going to replace it with slightly more elaborate markup. You can see I've given it a class of subcol that's going to be used to define the dimensions and the fact that it is one of 3 columns floating to the left, and this simply identifies it as the first of those columns. Each one has an image there with its alternative text, the header, and the relevant text. So I'm just going to paste the additional 2 articles in there so we can crack on. And there they are. You can see here within our wrapper we have our 3 articles, 1, 2, 3, and each one contains the relevant information. I'll save that. I'll just jump back into Google Chrome here and refresh the page, and you can see there the 3 columns relatively unstyled. Excellent. Now let's move on to our contact area. Again, 2 columns, each one of which contains a header. So let's just punch those in here. These are in our contacts section. So again, I'm going to copy and paste some of this, I'm afraid. Firstly, I'm going to use a div to contain that instead of an article. I'll just finish off that as I advised in a previous video. So that takes care of the header and the paragraph underneath. Now we need to add an image. Now this is going to be our Google map as shown here. Now we can either use, we could embed an elaborate JavaScript widget here, that's one option. We could go and copy and slice our own image, but you can actually relatively easily grab a dynamic static image from the Google with the Google API. This is the documentation here. Just go and Google static maps from Google and you'll find it. All you need to do is generate a path which will go to the Google server, and it will pull back an image depending on the attributes you use. You can determine the markers, the zoom level, the positioning, or all kinds of things. It's fantastic. So if I just jump back into Coda here, I'm going to quickly paste in the path that I have generated. I've gone for the easy option, and I've basically determined where our marker is going to be. This is our marker here with a color which I've pulled, the hex value which I've pulled from our PSD, given it a label of E, which I'm actually going to change. I'll give it S for smile, it's much better. And then I've determined where that is using the Envato headquarters street address. Perfectly simple. You can also determine the dimensions of your image there, and this sensor false just indicates that I don't have any kind of GPS geolocating jiggery pokery going on. I'm actually defining the location myself. So if I save that and jump back into Google Chrome and refresh the page, you'll see that it's pulled a perfect image from the Google servers. Excellent. So let's go back to our PSD. We had the address details underneath. Now just 2 quick divs with our address details underneath there. Oh, not Chrome, we're going Coda. So there's our image, and I'll just paste those 2 divs with a couple of paragraphs underneath. Now in the adjacent column we've got our form. I'm just going to copy and paste that in as well. There we go. Here's our second div, also with the class of col, with col2 identifying it there. The header, just the same as always. This opens up our form here, and you can see 3 paragraphs containing labels with various inputs. This first one has a label with a class of error. This is again going to be generated dynamically using our form validation script, but for the meantime I'm going to add it statically so we can style it properly when the time comes. And it ends with a button at the bottom. Just checking our PSD, that kind of takes care of everything there, which leaves us with just this footer. So we need to put in our footer a paragraph and 3 social links, which is fairly straightforward. I'll go and grab the paragraph, find our footer, which you'll now recognize as being very semantic, perfect, within the wrapper there, and there's that copyright paragraph. And lastly, I just wanted an unordered list, which I'm going to give a class of social. Neatly end it as so, and then I'm going to add 3 list elements. I'll give that an empty class for the time being, each containing an anchor. That's going to be our Skype one. Give that a class of Skype. Then we wanted a Twitter and a Facebook. There we go. So those are our links, and there's our copyright. I'll save that. Go and have a look in Chrome, see how we're doing. There we have our address details, second heading, our form button, copyright paragraph, and 3 social links. So that, quite neatly, in fewer than 200 lines of markup, and that includes the head of our document, is our entire markup, which is great. And in fact, some of that will actually be generated dynamically as well. So we'll be able to remove those soon too, which is fantastic. And we've done a good job of describing things as semantically as possible. Okay, it's time for some further reading. So let's just jump back into our presentation here. There we go. Firstly, for clarification on what semantics mean, have a look at this entry on Wikipedia. Then, for a more opinion-based article, see what Peter Gaston has to say on the importance of semantics on the web. This is a quick article in which he discusses aboutness. There's a new word for you. Lastly, for a solid reference on all the semantic elements currently available through HTML5, take a look at html5doctor.com. You'll also find a lot of discussion about how to use each element and what they mean. Now, before we jump into the next video, I have an assignment for you. I want you to finish off the HTML markup of our document, as I just demonstrated. It's good practice for all we've been discussing about semantics. Next time on 30 Days to Your First Website Design, we're going to continue with our design by looking further into the CSS. I'm Ian Yates, and from all of us at Tuts Plus, thanks for watching. Hi guys, welcome back to 30 Days to Your First Website Design, a Tuts Plus premium course. I'm Ian Yates, and today we're going to simply go a little further into the CSS of our web design. We'll begin as always by taking a quick look at what we're going to cover in this video. Well, we're going to open up our layout PSD, our HTML and our CSS so far, and concentrate on the column layout. We'll then examine the ClearFix hack to solve our floating problems. Then once we've completed that, I'll suggest some further reading and then set an assignment. Okay, this is a nice theory-free video, so let's dive straight into our PSD and remind ourselves of the progress so far. And here it is. Now, the completed PSD looks like this. As you remember, our markup was complete and we'd finished styling this upper area. We're now in the process of building these columns here, the 3 columns for our team and these 2 columns for our contact area. And if we look at how it's currently faring in the browser, we can see that some of the styling is still missing. We have the content, but we need to just style it correctly. So let's jump into our CSS and our HTML and figure out what needs doing next. Well, we have our columns here. These are our articles, if you remember. Each one has a class of subcol and is further identified by a secondary class to allow us to give us a little bit more control. Then we have our larger columns, each one having a class of col and a secondary class there. So let's go to the bottom of our CSS file and we'll add a section which we'll call columns, for obvious reasons. We'll begin with our larger columns, and I'll put down here our sub columns. Now each one is going to need a width, so we'll go back into our PSD, we'll bring up our guides and our grid and remind ourselves of the dimensions. Now you'll recall that we used the 960 grid framework, and we could in fact use the CSS that's provided with that framework had we not have used the grid in a sort of arbitrary way. As you can see, our columns actually consist of gutters on the outside and then the columns within them, and then we've actually used a column as our guttering, which is fine. We can do exactly whatever we please. The grid is there for for our use. But it means that